Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks, and today we have a screencast on U.S. imperialism of the 1950s, and specifically imperialism as it relates to Guatemala, a Central American country. So let's start our screencast and see what we can learn from this history. So during the Cold War, which of course was between the United States and the Soviet Union, and of course all of our allies, one point of view was that the United States got in lots of fights, lots of little wars. And it was all in the name of protecting the world because the world needed protection. Because after all, communism was growing and trying to take over the world, and communism was, from the US perspective, an evil movement that would subjugate and hurt the peoples of the world. So much of the world was happy that the US was getting into these fights. But another point of view was that the US military was getting into these fights as acts of imperialism to advocate for US interests, to make the US stronger. It also would result in the US going to these wars in order to control the world, not for good reasons, but for our own power. And a lot of the world hated that. So depending on which perspective you subscribe to, you would have a different take on today's presentation. Of course, today's presentation is going to follow kind of the perspective that the US was an imperialist power and acting out of its own interests. But, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So the example of this U.S. imperialism is going to be U.S. imperialism in Guatemala. And to understand this, let's tell our story. And our story begins back in 1951. So Guatemala is located in the Western Hemisphere, right between North and South America, technically part of North America and Central America. And it's really up on the northern border, right where Mexico is. So they're going to get a new leader in 1951. I don't pronounce things well, but we'll call him Arbenz. And Arbenz was well liked. But he did come to power in a very challenging time for Guatemala, and that would be that 70% of his people were illiterate. They couldn't read, and 80% were stuck or mired in poverty. And the primary cause, not the only cause, but the primary cause was that the richest 2% in Guatemala owned 72% of the land. That massive level of inequality is going to limit, of course, the potential of people to economically survive on the bottom end of that economy. Plus, when you have land, you can create businesses and job and basically potential to make money. Without land, poor people are often stuck being poor, and rich people are stuck being rich. So, if the rich control land and have all the resources, the poor can't get at the resources. So, there is a connection here. So, in 1951, Arbenz says, "This is what I got to change." So, his action number one was to do land reform. Land reform basically meant, in this case of Guatemala, that the most that one person was allowed to own was 673 acres. Now, if you owned any more land than that, the government will take it from you, nationalize that land. Now, the number one landowner that faced giving up land was the United States, at least in Guatemala, a U.S. business. And that U.S. business is going to be called the United Fruit Company, a huge company located in Guatemala. They were the largest banana company in the world. Today they are Chiquita Banana. They changed their name. But back then they were called United Fruit. So United Fruit Company was in Guatemala, and they had over 600,000 acres of land. And that was a lot more land than the limit, right? They basically were an economic powerhouse. They owned most of the railroads. They owned the harbors. They dominated the money. They employed so many people in Guatemala. They basically controlled the workers and the salaries and the abuse that the workers received. It was almost like United Fruit Company was a country within a country. They had a budget bigger than many countries. So as of 1951, Arbenz was like, nope, I'm going to do land reform. I'm going to take land away from them. And he ultimately takes that land and redistributes it to the poor. Now, the United States is not going to like this at all. It's almost as if Guatemala or Arbenz is stealing our land, the land of our companies. So this also resembled communism a little bit, right? The government becoming powerful, trying to create equity, taking away individual rights. So we weren't very happy about that. We are in a war against communism, the Cold War. This is the director of the CIA, a guy named Allen Dulles, and his brother, a Secretary of State, very powerful person, John Foster Dulles, are both going to go to President Eisenhower and say, we need to get rid of Arbenz. We need to kick him out of power. He's a communist, and he's hurting our country. Now, what was their reasoning exactly? Again, was that they wanted to protect American business, particularly the United Fruit Company, one of the biggest U.S. businesses around. But I'm going to say that they had a little bit of a conflict of interest. Both had been lawyers previously for the United Fruit Company, and made a lot of money off the United Fruit Company. In fact, owned a heavy percentage of the stock in the United Fruit Company, which meant the United Fruit Company losing all of that land and power is going to cost them money. So I would argue that they had a big conflict of interest, and they were acting under their own interests, but also the interests of the United States. Now, why else would Eisenhower do this? Well, there's lots of reasons Eisenhower started to turn against Arbenz. Well, Arbenz legalized the Communist Party. Now, that didn't mean he was a communist. He just said you're okay to think whatever way you want. If you want to think like communists, be a communist. And the United States, of course, saw this as a terrible slippery slope. We were at war with communism, and legalizing that party seemed really, really awful. Number three, besides land reform and legalizing a communist party, Guatemala made communist alliances. They were friends with, well, guess who? The Soviet Union. But they were also friends with Czechoslovakia and purchased weapons from Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia, of course, was friends with the Soviet Union. So, that's a big deal. So often the Czechoslovakia would sell weapons to U.S. allies, trying not to offend the United States. The Soviet Union would sell Czechoslovakia weapons. They would then sell those weapons to places like Guatemala. The United States was absolutely not okay with these communist friendships. Number four, in 1823, a long time ago, President James Monroe gave a speech called the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine basically was aimed at the world and said the Western Hemisphere is ours. The United States owns it. It's our backyard. It's under our control. Europe and everybody else, stay out of it. Stay out of our backyard. This is ours. That was the Monroe Doctrine, and the U.S. had spent every year since then trying to enforce it, kicking Europe and everybody else out of it. Well, in 1951, it looked like the Soviet Union is now trying to get into Latin America by turning these countries communist. And communist countries in Latin America would violate the Monroe Doctrine, but would make the United States very vulnerable. Because, of course, an attack from the Soviet Union would come from very far away, but an attack from our own backyard could absolutely leave us helpless. So we're like, we have to stop this. Number five, in the 1950s, it also was the age of McCarthyism, which was a time of the Red Scare, where Americans were pointing their fingers at everybody saying, you might be a communist. And if you were accused, your life would be destroyed. You certainly wouldn't get elected to office. You could also be accused of being soft on communism, and that wouldn't get you elected either. So if you wanted to get elected, particularly elected president of the United States, you needed to take a tougher stance on communism, or the Red Scare would eat you up. And Eisenhower knew this, and Eisenhower is going to take a tough stance on Guatemala, particularly Arbenz, thinking he might be a communist, and Eisenhower was going to try to crush him. Number six reason why Eisenhower went to attack Arbenz and get rid of him. The CIA, of course, at this time was massively overconfident. They thought they could get rid of any ruler at any time, and the president wouldn't even have to worry about it. This overconfidence was fueled by the successful coup that the CIA ran in Iran, where they basically got rid of the Iranian leader. And it was only a couple years before it happened in Guatemala. Number seven reason why Eisenhower was quick to do this was paternalism. Paternalism is this idea that the United States knows better than other peoples, and that we are basically smarter and a better moral compass, and we have to take care of all the weaker civilizations out there, and we know better than them. And ultimately, that type of racism is going to lead to us being very confident that we know better than them. They elected this leader, but we are going to put a better leader in for them. And it's for their own well good, the way you would treat a 3-year-old. So anyway, why did Eisenhower wish to remove Arbenz? Well, the land reform, number one reason. United Fruit Company losing all that land. Arbenz legalized the Communist Party. Arbenz was friendly with the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia, both communist nations. The Monroe Doctrine said communism wasn't allowed to infiltrate the Western Hemisphere. And so this was Eisenhower enforcing that. It was the age of McCarthyism, where even Eisenhower could be kicked out of office if he wasn't seen tough on communism. And the CIA was willing to do this and say that they could absolutely get rid of Arbenz because of their success in Iran. And of course, finally, the racist card of paternalism. We know better than them, so we're going to tell them what to do. So as of 1954, Eisenhower and the CIA put into place Operation PB Success. So Arbenz is going to be kicked out by the CIA and Eisenhower. Now, how are they going to do this? Well, the first step is they're going to recruit another Guatemalan leader, Armas, who's going to take over and lead the revolution. Now, a revolution has been going on in Guatemala for some time, but this is going to be a new surge, and we found him to put in charge of the new surge. We're going to recruit 480 troops. They're going to be his troops as he invades. Now, the second step is we're going to give these troops money. We're going to give them weapons. We're going to bring them all the way down to Honduras, who we had a great relationship with at the time, and is also right next to Guatemala. And we're going to give them extensive training. And at that point, after a little while goes by, this army and leader that we have, that's going to invade Guatemala and take out Arbenz, discovers they have a problem. And basically, their army is way too small. They can't take on Guatemala's army, Arbenz's army. They'll get crushed. So the United States says, well, we'll lend a hand. So the U.S. gets an idea and says, let's do some psychological warfare. Before the attack, what the United States does is we paid church leaders to give sermons that basically made Arbenz look evil. And slowly we're going to get people to switch, particularly in the countryside, anti-Arbenz and so on. We're going to drop leaflets from planes that basically make the government in Arbenz look bad. Again, basically lowering morale. And if people don't support Arbenz, they're not going to join his army, right? So it's going to cause people to switch sides to support the revolution. We are going to mail wooden coffins, empty wooden coffins, to Arbenz supporters, basically a death threat, so they'd be too scared to support Arbenz. And many of them are going to flee. We're going to mail non-functioning bombs to supporters of Arbenz. And again, many of them are going to be like, I better not get involved. I better not help out Arbenz. I better flee. We're even going to mail nooses, things that hang and kill people, to intimidate leaders in Arbenz's government so that they leave him. So in the end, the CIA is going to also, in basic areas of media like magazines and newspapers, going to publish hundreds of articles making Arbenz look evil, making their government look weak, and making the revolution seem inevitable. If you think something's inevitable, you're certainly not going to give up your life to stop it. So at this point, the CIA also goes on the air and does anti-government radio broadcasts. So endless broadcasts, which thousands of people in Guatemala could hear, are now hearing the revolution's inevitable. They're about to conquer the whole country, and that's going to really lower morale. And when all of Arbenz's supporters start thinking that they're going to lose and that their leader's evil, they're not going to be willing to join the military or show up to fight for their country. And that's exactly what happens. Now, during the attack, as the U.S., the CIA, Guatemalans invade the country, the U.S. goes on the air and actually constantly gives false updates saying, the invading force is about to conquer the whole country. The rebel troops are everywhere. They're conquering everything, when there was really only like 400 of those troops. So the capital of Guatemala, if you lived there, you were like, wow, they're invading from every side. We're done. Give up, flee. And that's what they did. So the loyalists are going to flee, and Arbenz is going to find himself without much help. We're even going to go as far as putting huge speakers on the ceiling of tall buildings in the capital of Guatemala, and we're going to put fake sounds of war blasting across the city so that everybody there would flee because they knew the war was coming, and our 400-person army now seemed like a 10,000-person army. I mean, talk about stagecraft, right? The CIA was amazing at this point. So many loyalists are going to flee, and even members of the Arbenz's government aren't going to show up, and they're going to hide. The U.S. is even going to take planes and disguise them as Guatemalan planes and fly them over Guatemala City and drop bombs. So it seemed inevitable that Arbenz was going to be defeated and deposed, and people would not go to support somebody who was going to be defeated anyway. There was rumors of a U.S. invasion that was said, because absolutely the U.S. invading would end all dreams of Arbenz. Why would I support him? So ultimately, the results of all this psychological warfare was the U.S. never did invade, but Arbenz is going to run, and his troops are going to run, and ultimately he's not going to have any support. So on June 27th, 1954, not altogether that long after the revolution started, Arbenz is out. Communism is also out. There's going to be a new leader. Again, Armas, our hand-picked CIA-trained leader, is now going to take over the country. We basically won this little revolution, and by we, I mean the United States and the CIA. CIA Director Allen Dulles said this was victory of democracy over communism. Of course, Arbenz had been elected by his own people, and Armas had not, so it's kind of ironically wrong. Now, the legacy of this invasion by the CIA and deposing of their leader is very quickly, Arbenz was elected into power, but now there's not going to be elections for the next 40 years. Democracy is gone, which is really, really sad, because after that, a bunch of dictators are going to do whatever they want with their people. The country's going to break into civil war, pretty much one civil war after another for the next couple of decades, leading to tens of thousands of people killed. Arbenz was one of the most stable leaders that had been around. We kind of got rid of that stability. Latin America is going to know all about this, and there's going to be massive resentment towards the United States. And let's not act like that doesn't matter. When the U.S. is the most hated country in the world or close to it. That prevents us from building alliances and gaining support and influence on the world. And that leads to us having less power and influence because much of Latin America is united together against our policies. So another legacy of this was our CIA. The CIA in America basically got overconfident. They had deposed the leader of Iran and now of Guatemala, and they're going to feel that they're unstoppable. They can do anything. So what do? When Cuba's leader becomes communist, they do a huge mistake, and the CIA orders an invasion of Bay of Pigs, just like Guatemala, and that's going to result in a failure and Cuba bringing in nuclear weapons to protect itself from future attacks, which could have blown up the U.S. significantly. In fact, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we ever came to nuclear war of all dying. So a huge consequence. Now, ultimately, we've heard this story, but the essential question is, should the United States covertly overthrow a leader of another country if it's in the best interest of the United States? In the 50s, we were scared of communism, and this might be a communist leader, although he wasn't. But if we truly think that another country's leader is hurting the U.S., is it acceptable to covertly throw him out? Or is that unfair that we're messing with the sovereignty of a foreign country and we should leave that country alone? Um, Ultimately, only you can make that decision, but I will tell you world consensus and international law says countries are not allowed to depose leaders of other countries, no matter how much they disagree with them. So we all have to make our own decision, though, right? So in the end, in 1999, not altogether that long, President Bill Clinton, at the end of his term, traveled down to Guatemala and apologized for this. Apologized for the United States. It is important that I state clearly that support for military forces and intelligence units which engaged in violence and widespread repression was wrong, and the United States must not repeat that mistake. So in the end, we gave an apology to Guatemala, not that it helps 80 years later, but we did apologize. And that is the story of U.S. imperialism in Guatemala. Thank you for listening, and hopefully we can draw some historical lessons from this behavior to pave a path in our future that's a little better morally correct, I think. Thank you so much, and enjoy your day.